student, myself Divya Parmar, welcome you all to the online session of Principle of Electronic Communication, in which we will learn about types of modulation. So, let's start with the contents. First, modulation, types of modulation, continuous wave modulation and pulse modulation. So, let's start with what is modulation. Modulation is the process of varying one or more properties of a periodic waveform in accordance with the carrier signal. So, typically that contains information to be transmitted. Now, types of modulation. There are many types of modulation depending upon the modulation techniques used. They are classified as shown in the diagram. Types of modulation: continuous wave modulation and pulse modulation. Continuous wave modulation again classified into amplitude modulation and angle modulation. Again, angle modulation is classified as a frequency modulation and phase modulation. Same as pulse modulation is classified into two parts. First is digital modulation and another one is the analog modulation. Digital modulation is classified into pulse code modulation and delta modulation. Same as analog modulation is classified into PAM, pulse amplitude modulation, pulse width modulation and pulse position modulation. Now, start with the continuous wave modulation. The types of modulations are broadly classified into two parts: continuous wave modulation and pulse modulation. So, let's discuss about continuous wave modulation. In the continuous wave modulation, a high frequency sine wave is used as a carrier wave. This is further divided into amplitude modulation and angle modulation. If the amplitude of the high frequency carrier wave is varied in accordance with the instantaneous amplitude of the modulating signal, then such a technique is called as amplitude modulation. Now, angle modulation. If the angle of a carrier wave is varied in accordance with the instantaneous value of the modulating signal, then such a technique is called as angle modulation. The angle modulation is further divided into frequency modulation and phase modulation. If the frequency of the carrier wave is varied in accordance with the instantaneous value of the modulating signal, then such a technique is called as a frequency modulation. If the phase of the high frequency carrier wave is varied in accordance with the instantaneous value of the modulating signal, then such a technique is called as a phase modulation. Now, the next part is pulse modulation. First, pulse modulation. In pulse modulation, a periodic sequence of a rectangular pulse is used as a carrier wave. This is further divided into analog and digital modulation. So, first, analog modulation. In analog modulation technique, if the amplitude, duration or position of a pulse is varied in accordance with the instantaneous values of the baseband modulating signal, then such a technique is called as a pulse amplitude modulation, pulse width modulation or pulse positioning modulation. So, first, pulse amplitude modulation. In pulse amplitude modulation, the amplitude of the regular interval of a periodic pulses or the electromagnetic pulse is varied in accordance in proportion of sample of modulating signal or the message signal. This is an analog type of modulation. The next is pulse position modulation, that is PPM. In the pulse position modulation, the position of the pulse in a signal by taking the reference signal is varied in according to the sample value of a message or the modulating signal instantaneously. The next is PWM, that means pulse width modulation. It is a type of analog modulation. In pulse width modulation or a pulse duration modulation, the width of the pulse carrier is varied in accordance with the sample values of a message signal or the modulating signal. The next is digital modulation. In the digital modulation, The modulation technique used is pulse code modulation, where the analog signal is converted into a digital form of ones and zeros. As a resultant is coded pulse train. This is called PCM. This is further developed as a delta modulation. Hence, PCM is a technique where the analog signals are converted into a digital form. This is all about the various types of modulation we use in communication system. Assignment questions regarding to this video. First, what is modulation? Second, explain types of modulation in detail. See you in the next session of the subject Principle of Electronic Communication. Thank you.
If you like this video, please subscribe and like our YouTube channel LJPEC, and don't forget to click on the bell icon to get latest video update fast.